The story of the Messina crime family begins in the year 1915 when 20-year-old Sicilian immigrant Mario Messina immigrated to the Cerveza Heights section of Duke's Liberty City. Messina, who was born in Messina, Sicily in 1895, arrived in Liberty City in the summer of 1915 with less than $1 to his name. Messina, however, had an uncle, Giuseppe Bruno, who had settled in Cerveza Heights a few years prior, and upon his arrival Messina would move into an apartment with Bruno and his family at Huntington Street and Dukes Boulevard. At this time, the Cerveza Heights neighborhood was dominated by Italian-American immigrants, and the corner of Huntington and Dukes was then a sprawling neighborhood marketplace. Messina at this time would begin to commit his first crimes in the United States when he would recurrently steal from various street vendors at Huntington and Dukes to feed himself. Living at the apartment on Dukes Boulevard, Messina would become closely acquainted with his first cousins, Giuseppe Bruno's two sons, Marco and Alphonse. While Marco and Alphonse had lived in Dukes for the several years prior to their cousin Mario's arrival, they and their various neighborhood friends would do work for certain gang leaders in the area. Marco Bruno, who was Mario's age, was known as a petty thief. However, Alphonse Bruno, who was 5 years older than Mario and Marco, had by 1915 gained a reputation as a respected rising gangster in the neighborhood, and was affiliated with local gang leaders Giuseppe Joe the Bat Chironi and Mauricio Mike Scars Solozo. Chironi and Solozo were known as the most powerful gangsters in Cerveza Heights and led a gang that practically owned the neighborhood. Because the neighborhood was made up of newly arrived Sicilian and Southern Italian immigrants, most of whom refused to trust or report to any law enforcement, and many of whom were involved in some capacity of crime, the gang was able to gain tremendous power in the community. The gang, which was called the Palermo Gang after Chironi and Solozo's homeland of Palermo, Sicily, was well respected in Cerveza Heights and were known to carry out favors for their neighbors. The Palermo Gang was even respected by the store owners they extorted, as they believed they were paying for top-notch protection. The Palermo Gang was also feared in the neighborhood and were known to carry out brutal acts of violence against those who defied them. In Mario Messina's first year in Cerveza Heights, he and his cousin Marco were not heavily involved in the Palermo Gang. The two at this time were more interested in playing stickball or soccer in the street, chasing neighborhood girls, and hanging out in a pool hall on Dukes Boulevard. Mario and Marco, however, would become known thieves in the area. Eventually, in spring of 1916, the pair would have a minor run-in with the law when they were arrested for theft in Meadow Hills, Dukes. Into the summer of 1916, while Alphonse Bruno had continued to rise in the Palermo Gang, Marco Bruno and Mario Messina would continue to play a minor role in the gang. Mario Messina at this time was known as the best street soccer player in Cerveza Heights and was also known for his skill in stickball. It was during this time in summer of 1916 when friends would convince Mario Messina to begin amateur boxing at a gym on Charleston Avenue. Messina, despite his lack of size at 5'7" and 150 pounds, was known to be exceptionally tough with his hands in the street. Eventually, Messina would become a successful amateur boxer and would box under the name Johnny Marks. Messina was a dangerous fighter and had a right hook that could break his opponent's jaws. Messina was known as an angry fighter, and his strength in boxing seemed to come from a place of rage within him. Messina, who was known in the neighborhood for his easygoing personality and sense of humor, seemed to flip a switch when he became angry and would transform into a different, more malevolent figure. By winter of 1916, Messina was hanging around his cousin Alphonse, and Alphonse began to see the potential in Mario Messina. Eventually, around Christmas of 1916, Alphonse would begin to invite Mario to a Palermo Gang-owned social club on Huntington Street. By 1917, Mario and Marco were both regulars at the club, and the two would eventually work directly for Mike Scars Solozo. Messina at this time was used as an enforcer for the gang, and would brutally beat many people on orders of the Palermo Gang. By the summer of 1917, Mario Messina was Mike Scars' most trusted enforcer, and Messina was known to use a baseball bat on his various victims. This was a method passed down to Messina from Palermo gang leader Giuseppe Joe the Bat Chironi, who made a name for himself in Cerveza Heights during the turn of the century for using a baseball bat to violently kill his adversaries. As Messina began to carry out various acts of brutality for the Palermo gang, Chironi and Silozo would become impressed with Messina's vicious tendencies, and this would earn Messina respect in the gang. It was during this time that Mario Messina became enthralled with the world of organized crime. Messina, who had lived his entire life with little to no money to spend, was now earning amounts of money he had never seen before working for Mike Scar's Silozo. Messina was also making money boxing on Charleston Avenue, and by fall of 1917 would move into his own apartment at Huntington Street and Inchin Avenue. Also in fall of 1917, 22-year-old Messina would marry his mistress Regina Melucci from Cerveza Heights. From 1918 into 1919, Messina would continue to rise in the Palermo gang, and would gain the unanimous respect of his peers in the gang. Messina would also continue to fight every few weeks at the gym on Charleston Avenue. Also around this time, Messina would become acquainted with fellow boxer from Sicily, 26-year-old Franco the Fist Nunziata, and Messina and Nunziata would commit various crimes together. Nunziata, like Messina, was known to be especially sadistic in his crimes, and this helped Nunziata to work his way into Mario Messina's inner circle, as Messina would see Nunziata as a capable gangster like himself. Throughout 1918, Messina and Nunziata would carry out acts of violence that would make them two of the most feared men in Dukes. As time went on, Messina would additionally organize various successful gambling rackets, and by the end of 1919, Messina was running the neighborhood's most popular floating craps game and operating highly lucrative card games. Messina at this time also put together a fearless burglary team that was known to commit various forms of theft around the city, and Messina also began to extort several neighborhood business owners on his own accord. By this point, it became clear to Chironi and Silozo that Mario Messina was more than just muscle. Messina and his cousin Marco Bruno had also built a following of roughly 15 to 20 loyal followers from Cerveza Heights, and by this point it was clear that Mario Messina was leading his generation of gangsters in Cerveza Heights. Then in fall of 1920, the Liberty City underworld would be changed forever when alcohol was banned across the United States. This brought Liberty City's underground rackets to higher stakes than ever before. While Mario Messina, who was 25 years old at the time, had no ability to smuggle liquor into the city, the outreach of the Palermo gang and Joe the Bat Chironi helped them to quickly establish connections with Italian bootleggers in Canada. And within 2 weeks of the Prohibition law, the Palermo gang was already flooding the streets of Liberty City with alcohol. Chironi and Silozo would immediately begin selling liquor out of various shops in Cerveza Heights, starting what were some of the city's first speakeasies. The Palermo gang also began to supply various gangs around the city with large quantities of liquor. This included various Irish gangs in East Dukes, several smaller Italian gangs in Broker, and another Italian gang in Algonquin known as the Enchiladas. As the Palermo gang began to rise as top bootleggers in the city, they would amass serious wealth all at once. After just a year of the Prohibition, Chironi and Silozo had nearly doubled their monthly income. During this time, Mario Messina worked as an armed security guard for Chironi and Silozo, and Messina would watch over many high-level liquor sales. Messina would also work as a security guard at various Palermo gang speakeasies around Dukes and Broker. By the end of 1921, the Palermo gang was known as one of the city's top bootlegging syndicates, along with the Terranova gang of Broker and the Lupacella gang of the Bohun. The Palermo gang was also allied with several gangs, including the Terranova gang and various Irish gangs in East Dukes. However, around this time, the Palermo gang would run into trouble with a rising Irish gang based in Steinway Dukes, led by 46-year-old Irish immigrant from Dublin, Ireland, Bill the Bomber O'Brien. O'Brien's gang was an up-and-coming bootlegging operation out of Steinway, a nearby town to Cerveza Heights. By December of 1921, the O'Brien gang had robbed 2 Palermo gang liquor shipments in East Dukes near Francis International Airport. A week later, Mario Messina, Marco Bruno, and Franco the Fist Nunziata would drive to the corner of Morris Street and Trenton Avenue, and the three would get into an intense gun battle with the O'Brien gang in the street in broad daylight. Several O'Brien associates were killed in the attack, however Messina, Bruno, and Nunziata would all escape unscathed. The following week, O'Brien would send gunmen to a Palermo speakeasy at Inchin Avenue and Thornton Street, and another gun battle would ensue. Mario Messina, who was armed in the lobby of the storefront, would take out 3 of the 4 shooters in the gunfight. Following this, the Palermo gang and O'Brien gang would continue to war over control of Dukes. By the spring of 1922, there was a clear generational divide in the Palermo gang. While the notorious leaders Joe Chironi and Mike Silozo still controlled the many senior members of the gang, the Palermo gang now had a growing number of younger members that were loyal first and foremost to Mario Messina. This generation was led by Mario Messina, Messina's older cousin Alphonse Bruno, who had by this point become a close confidant of Messina, Marco Bruno, who was Messina's right-hand man, and Franco the Fist Nunziata, who was Messina's most skilled enforcer. As Mario Messina grew older, so did his influence in Cerveza Heights, and eventually Messina would begin to plot his takeover. In September of 1922, members of the Steinway-based O'Brien gang would reach out to Mario Messina at a restaurant in downtown Broker, asking for Messina's partnership and suggesting Messina break away from the Palermo gang. While Mario Messina would refuse these offers and be hesitant to trust the O'Brien gang, eventually Mario Messina would discreetly establish a business relationship with Bill the Bomber O'Brien. O'Brien, who by 1922 had established himself as the top Irish bootlegger in Dukes, was planning to organize 2 new speakeasies in East Island City, Dukes, and 1 in Shotler Broker. O'Brien offered Messina a share in all 3 of these speakeasies in order to operate in East Island City, which was then under Palermo rule. Messina would accept this deal and eventually would establish gambling and prostitution operations around Steinway in collaboration with the O'Brien gang. In July of 1923, Bill the Bomber O'Brien would introduce Mario Messina to powerful Bohan-based crime boss Carmen Lupacella, and eventually Messina and Lupacella would form an alliance through their shared Sicilian heritage. Also around this time, senior members of the Palermo gang would discover the O'Brien-operated speakeasies in East Island City and would begin to hear rumors of Messina's involvement. When this information reached Joe the Bat Chironi and Mike Scars Silozo, Messina would find himself in a dangerous position. By this point in 1923, Mario Messina and his crew were operating out of a separate social club than the other members of the Palermo gang, and the divide was becoming more pronounced. It was at this point Mario Messina would reach out to Carmen Lupacella, and the two would plot the execution of Chironi and Silozo. In August of 1923, Mario Messina and Alphonse Bruno would visit their mentor, Mike Scars Silozo, at his Bunker Hill Avenue home late at night. Despite the tensions, Silozo would invite the two inside, and soon after Silozo would be shot 11 times and killed. The following day, Messina would arrange for Lupacella gunmen to shoot up a large gathering of senior Palermo gang members at a Huntington Street social club. While this was happening, Mario Messina, Alphonse Bruno, Marco Bruno, and Franco the Fist Nunziata would break into Palermo gang leader Joe the Bat Chironi's downtown Broker apartment. However, Chironi's apartment was empty. Following this, Mario Messina's crew was actively searching for Chironi and taking over full control of the many rackets left from Silozo and Chironi. For several months, Chironi would be in hiding, and former members of the old Palermo gang were to now follow Messina or be killed. During this time, many surviving Palermo gang members would leave Cerveza Heights for various areas around the city. In January of 1924, Messina would receive a tip that Giuseppe Joe the Bat Chironi was hiding in East Holland, Algonquin. Soon after, Chironi would be found dead with shotgun wounds in his apartment at Uranium Street and Codd Avenue. With Chironi and Silozo now gone, and the former Palermo gang now defunct, the power in Cerveza Heights had shifted to the Mario Messina crew. Over the next several months, the now 29-year-old Mario Messina would establish himself as the new Don of Cerveza Heights and would make new bootlegging connections through Carmen Lupacella. During this time, Mario Messina would control the Cerveza Heights and East Island City neighborhoods in Dukes and would tax any gangs that operated in the area. By this point in early 1924, Mario Messina had a strong crew of roughly 25 soldiers, and the Messina gang was the most powerful criminal syndicate in Dukes. While the Messina gang would be unchallenged in their takeover of Dukes, they would eventually run into problems with the Terranova Syndicate of Broker and Algonquin. The Terranova Syndicate, which was another one of the most powerful syndicates in Liberty City, was long affiliated with Chironi and Silozo, and wanted to have Messina killed for his brazen actions. Terranova syndicate leader Dario Terranova, in particular, wanted Messina killed, and in June of 1924, Mario Messina and Marco Bruno would be shot at entering a vehicle on Montauk Avenue in downtown Broker. Mario Messina, however, saw the Terranova gunman pulling up and was able to jump on his cousin Marco, and the two hid behind their vehicle. As this happened, one of Mario Messina's drivers came out of the car with a Tommy gun and began to shoot at the Terranova vehicle, forcing them to drive off. For weeks following this botched attack, the Messina crew had no ideas as to who could have orchestrated the attack, as Messina had had few to no dealings with the Terranova syndicate in the past years. However, by the end of 1924, Messina had received information on Dario Terranova and the Terranova syndicate, and began to plan their demise. In January of 1925, at a high-profile downtown Broker party held by Liberty City swingers star Tony D'Amato, Mario Messina and Carmen Lupicella would be introduced to rising star in the Terranova syndicate, 33-year-old Carlo Gambetti. Messina, upon being introduced to Gambetti, became enraged at the mention of the Terranova syndicate, but Messina did not show his anger. The two would shake hands, but a strong tension was felt. Gambetti would later find Messina outside of the function on Montauk Avenue, and Gambetti would make it clear to Messina that many in the Terranova syndicate wanted Dario Terranova gone, and that he planned to take over the Terranova syndicate and make Dario Terranova pay. Less than a week later, Carlo Gambetti would follow Don Dario Terranova home from a Denver Avenue social club and would shoot him 5 times in the back of the head, killing him. As this happened, Carlo Gambetti quickly rose to the top of the former Terranova syndicate, a powerful organization that held strong territory in both Broker and Algonquin. As this happened, Mario Messina and Carmen Lupicella would align their groups with the Carlo Gambetti syndicate, and the three groups would go on to have strong connections. For the next several years, the Mario Messina syndicate would rise in their own right as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Liberty City, and Mario Messina would become highly influential in the Liberty City underworld. By 1927, Messina would open several speakeasies and gambling dens near Earp Street and Tuscarora Avenue in the Shopler section of Broker, and by the end of 1927, Messina would establish a new loyal street crew to operate on Earp Street. Messina would appoint up-and-coming gangster from Cerveza Heights 25-year-old Nicholas "Nick the Blade" Finelli as leader of the Earp Street crew in Broker. Also around this time, Messina would put together a new street crew to run his East Island City territory. This crew, which operated at Hooper Street and Dukes Boulevard, would be headed by Franco the Fist Nunziata, and would be referred to as the Nunziata crew. Franco Nunziata, who grew up at Hooper Street and Dukes Boulevard, was well known and respected in East Island City, and upon his promotion, Nunziata would eventually become one of the most powerful members of the Messina syndicate. By the late 1920s, with the Messina syndicate operating in various areas of the city, Messina would have his cousins Alphonse and Marco Bruno run the Cerveza Heights area, and Messina would run his organization through his various crew leaders. In 1929, Messina would establish a fourth crew in the predominantly Irish area of Steinway Dukes, which operated at Morris Street and Brandon Avenue. This crew would be led by 40-year-old Sabino, the Cigar Civello. Sabina the Cigar Civello and the Messina syndicate's Steinway crew would have positive relations with the O'Brien syndicate that controlled Steinway. Going into the year 1930, Mario Messina's organization was one of the most powerful in the city, and Messina had 4 major street crews operating in various areas of the city. Also during this time, Messina would continue to strengthen his relationship with other Italian-American syndicate leaders around the city, and Messina would become a highly respected figure in the American Mafia. In 1931, the Mario Messina Syndicate was one of 5 Liberty City crime syndicates to form the Five Families Commission, the other families being the Gambetti family ran by Carlo Gambetti, the Pavano family ran by Marco the Typewriter Centrella, the Lupicella family ran by Carmen Lupicella, and the Ancelotti family ran by Giacomo Ancelotti. With the Prohibition era now over, these 5 families would work together to develop new lucrative rackets around the city. Around this time, Mario Messina would officially appoint Alphonse Bruno as consigliere of the family and Marco Bruno as underboss. During the early 1930s, Mario Messina and his various street crews would develop several highly successful underground casinos around Liberty City. The Messina family would eventually collaborate with the Gambetti family in operating these underground casinos, and soon the casinos would be frequented by many politicians, celebrities, and professional athletes in Liberty City. While Marco Bruno and others were operating many of the Messina family's more traditional gambling operations on Huntington Street, this new form of high-class gambling around the city was helping the Messina family grow and earning Mario Messina the same type of money he made bootlegging. Also in 1935, Mario Messina would use his enforcers to extort several Dukes-based union officials. This would become a highly lucrative racket for the Messina family. Additionally, by 1935, Earp Street capo Nicholas "Nick the Blade" Finelli had become one of the most popular bookmakers in Liberty City, with a sports book operating in various areas in Broker and Algonquin. Finelli's bookmaking crew would take bets from many of the high-class players that would frequent Mario Messina's underground casino nights. In 1936, members of the Earp Street crew working under Finelli would be arrested for heroin trafficking, and while Finelli was able to avoid prosecution, these arrests would bring serious heat onto the Messina family. Then in 1937, a Messina-operated tavern at Sundance Street and Seneca Avenue would be raided, and members of the Earp Street crew would once again be arrested for heroin trafficking. When one of these Earp Street associates would testify against Messina capo Nick the Blade Finelli, Finelli would be charged with conspiracy to traffic narcotics and would be sentenced to 11 years in Liberty State Correctional Facility. Finelli would be succeeded in his role as capo over the broker-based Earp Street crew by his brother Luigi "Louis Wheels" Finelli, the informant who gave up information on Nick the Blade Finelli, and the Earp Street crew would later be found dead in his Rotterdam Hill apartment with his head violently crushed. By 1937, with the Messina family under pressure, Mario Messina would begin to enforce a strict policy that prohibited his soldiers from dealing with drugs in any form. This stance would be shared by Carlo Gambetti and the Gambetti family, and it would be known in the streets that for a soldier to violate this rule would result in their death. With bootlegging now a thing of the past, and drug trafficking now strictly prohibited for Messina family soldiers, the Messina street crews at this time would be involved in high-level gambling, loan sharking, and various forms of theft and extortion. In 1938, Mario Messina would move with his family into a spacious three-flat on Bunker Hill Avenue in Cerveza Heights. Messina during this time was operating out of a Huntington Street social club which had long been the headquarters of the Messinas in Cerveza Heights. By this time, Messina had lived in Cerveza Heights for more than 20 years and was considered a legend in the neighborhood, treating the neighborhood residents like family. Messina would be known to his Cerveza Heights neighbors simply as Don Mario. However, many of Messina's close friends would refer to him as Johnny Marks, a reference to his old boxing name. By the early 1940s, as Mario Messina would make many political connections in Dukes and Algonquin, the Messina family would become entrenched in Liberty City's labor and transportation unions, specifically in Dukes. By 1944, every active labor and transportation union in Dukes would be under Messina rule, and Messina by this point would control the various city councilmen that represented the borough of Dukes. Messina would also have union interest in the northern part of Broker. The Messina territory at this point in the mid-40s extended across Dukes. In 1945, Mario Messina would establish connections at Francis International Airport, which at the time was a major hub for international cargo shipping. As Messina would take control of cargo shipping at the airport, various business entities, including the other four families, would pay the Messinas to import them various goods. Messina at this time was on positive standings with all of the other four families, as the other families all saw Messina as an asset. Trouble would arise in June of 1946 when Messina family underboss and head of the Huntington Street branch of the family, 51-year-old Marco Bruno, would be pulled over on Dukes Boulevard with longtime soldier Rocco DiPietro. When LCPD officers searched Bruno's vehicle, an illegal firearm was found along with several stolen diamonds. The diamonds, which at the time were valued at roughly $3,000 apiece, were traced back to a Bo Abo robbery that took place days prior, As neither Bruno or DiPietro would give up any information, eventually the two would both be charged with grand larceny in connection with the diamonds. In reality, the diamonds had been stolen by Huntington Street-based Messina associates Salvatore Lino and Carlo Tommaso, and were given directly to Marco Bruno just hours before being pulled over and searched. Marco Bruno and Rocco DiPietro would both plead not guilty, but with their refusal to make any statements, would eventually be found guilty and sentenced to 14 years each in Liberty State Correctional Facility. Following this sentencing, Don Mario Messina would appoint 50-year-old Vincent Vinny Bugs Scordo as underboss of the Messina family, and 38-year-old Joseph the Cook Pizzono as captain of the Huntington Street crew, formerly ran by Marco Bruno. Scordo and Pizzono were both longtime highly respected members of the Messina family and would be highly successful leaders in Bruno's absence. As the Messina family headed into the 1950s, they were a thriving organization. Though the Messina family did not have the power nor wealth of other families like the Pavanos and Gambettis, the Messinas had tremendous influence over the borough of Dukes, and were on good standings with the other families on the commission. By this point, Don Mario Messina was one of the city's most respected and well-connected crime figures. Messina at this point was still living with his wife and children at this Bunker Hill home, and maintained his reputation as the king of Cerveza Heights. In 1953, the now 58-year-old Don Mario Messina would be indicted on extortion charges by the Liberty City District Attorneys. Also included in the indictment was Messina captain Franco Nunziata, Messina soldiers Vincent Scordo, Antonio Costano, and James Bernardino, several corrupt union officials based in Dukes, and several corrupt LCPD officers from the East Island City Precinct in Dukes. After a trial that would last nearly a year, as the confidential informants in the case were unable to come up with solid testimony against Mario Messina, and with the help of high-powered Liberty City attorney Ira Siegel, charges against Messina would be dropped in May of 1954. Charges against Messina family captain Franco the Fist Nunziata would also be dropped in May of 1954. However, several of Nunziata's top soldiers would be sentenced for their direct roles in union extortion. Following these legal troubles, the Messina family would place a great emphasis on secrecy and evading law enforcement. In addition to this, the Messinas were on high alert for what they felt to be informants within their family. In February of 1955, corrupt LCPD officers made Don Mario Messina aware that one of his longtime soldiers, Sterling the Snake Nicolazzo, had been a confidential informant with the FIB for several years, and that Nicolazzo's cooperation had led to the Messina family indictment of the prior year. Following this, Nicolazzo, who was a made man and a senior member of the Nunziata crew, was told to report to an East Island City social club on Hooper Street for what he believed to be a routine crew meeting. However, when Nicolazzo arrived, fellow Nunziata crew member 65-year-old James Bernardino would lead him to a back room, and after hitting Nicolazzo over the head, knocking him over, Bernardino would eventually hang Nicolazzo on a meat hook through his rectum, interrogating him for more than an hour until he would finally die of a heart attack. This brutal murder would earn Bernardino the nickname Jimmy the Hook, and many in the Messina family would joke about the gruesome event. This killing would exemplify the ruthless nature of the Messina crime family and the levels they would go to protect themselves and their interests. In July of 1955, Mario Messina's 26-year-old daughter Caterina Messina would marry 30-year-old rising Messina family soldier, James Little Jimmy Feccarazzo. Feccarazzo, who was a made member of the Earp Street crew and broker, was a serious earner involved in bookmaking, prostitution, and various forms of extortion. During this time in the mid-1950s, as the greaser culture spread across American cities, young men across Liberty City began organizing youth street gangs in the more working-class neighborhoods in Liberty City. In Cerveza Heights, a gang arose at Huntington Street and Dukes Boulevard known as the Hunters Street Gang. The Hunters, which was comprised of Italian-American youths ranging from 15 to 20-year-old, had gained a large presence around Cerveza Heights by 1955, and were known as one of the toughest youth street gangs in Cerveza Heights. The Hunters were led by 21-year-old Johnny Frank and his 20-year-old brother Michael Frank. The Frank brothers were born in Dukes to Sicilian parents who were originally called the DeFranciscos before immigrating to Liberty City. The Hunter Street Gang, who frequented the corner of Huntington and Dukes near the primary Messina family social club, would eventually become acquainted with Don Mario Messina, and Messina and the Huntington Street crew would take a liking to the gang. By the late 1950s, another Italian-American youth gang would form in Cerveza Heights near Livingston Street and Bunker Hill Avenue, calling themselves the Bunker Hill Boys. At this point, the LC-24 building on Bunker Hill Avenue had not yet been constructed, and Bunker Hill Avenue was then littered with flats from Livingston Street all the way up to Hancock Street, and many of the Bunker Hill Boys would grow up in these flats. Also living in a flat on Bunker Hill Avenue was Don Mario Messina, and the Bunker Hill Boys, similar to the Hunters, would develop a positive relationship with Mario Messina, who was friendly with virtually everyone in Cerveza Heights. During this time, the Bunker Hill Boys and the Hunters would develop a rivalry around the neighborhood. As the Messina crime family headed into the year 1960, the Messinas, while not as powerful as other families, were still highly successful in their own right. By this point, the now 65-year-old Mario Messina was still one of the most influential crime figures in Liberty City, and Messina had only grown wiser with age. In July of 1960, Messina's 65-year-old cousin Marco Bruno, the Messina family's former underboss, was released after serving 14 years in Liberty State Correctional Facility. Upon Bruno's release, Bruno would immediately be placed in a captain role over the Huntington Street crew. And Vinnie Bugs Scordo, who had grown to be one of Messina's most trusted confidants, would remain the Messina family underboss. In the mid-1960s, the greaser gangs that formed in Cerveza Heights were now serious criminal groups, and the Hunters and Bunker Hill Boys were now in the midst of a violent war. While Mario Messina and the Messina crime family would attempt to mediate gang violence in the Cerveza Heights neighborhood, the war between the Hunters and the Bunker Hill Boys would soon prove beyond control. In summer of 1965, Hunter Street gang leader Johnny Frank would be shot and killed at age 31 in Cerveza Heights by members of the Bunker Hill Boys. Following this murder, the Hunters would appoint 23-year-old rising star out of Cerveza Heights, Harvey Noto, as leader of the gang. Harvey Noto, who was born in 1942, grew up on the corner of Huntington Street and Inchin Avenue in a neighborhood entrenched with the Messina crime family. Noto would join the Hunter Street gang at age 13 in 1955, and during these years Noto would rack up several minor arrests and would be involved in many fights. Notably, in 1958, Harvey Noto would be arrested and charged with grand theft auto at age 16. This would result in Noto's first brief stint with incarceration, as Noto would spend several months at a youth detention center in upstate Liberty. By 1959, Harvey Noto had developed a large crew of young hoods to surround him, and Noto was acting as a loan shark and bookmaker, as well as organizing various cargo truck robberies. By 1960, Noto, at just 18 years old, was running a small empire with his friends in the Hunter Street gang, and was a top earner for then Hunter Street gang leader Johnny Frank, who saw Harvey Noto as the future of Cerveza Heights. By 1965, with the death of Johnny Frank, the now 23-year-old Harvey Noto was the logical successor in the Hunter Street gang. While Noto led the massive Hunter Street gang, Noto had a smaller close circle of friends that, in addition to being high-ranking Hunters gang members, were consistently around him and considered his top men. This included Charles Chucky Lino, age 20, Carmen Beans DiRazio, age 22, Joe D.B. DeBarro, age 28, and Lorenzo Larry Snuff Scalise, age 23. While there were many others that were around Harvey Noto and the Hunter Street gang, these four were Harvey Noto's closest associates. Soon after the death of Johnny Frank, Harvey Noto would instruct his gang to actively retaliate against the Bunker Hill Boys on site, and for the rest of 1965 into 1966, more than 150 shootings were attributed to the Hunters' Bunker Hill Boys war. In 1966, Harvey Noto and the Hunter Street gang would form an alliance with the Park Boys of Meadow Hills Dukes, which was another predominantly Italian street gang that had ties to the Gambetti crime family. Also in 1966, Mario Messina's cousin and right-hand man, Huntington Street legend Marco Bruno, would die of natural causes at age 71. Bruno would be succeeded in his captain role over the Huntington Street crew by 57-year-old Massimo Benny the Stench Grasso. Benny the Stench Grasso was a longtime Huntington Street heavyweight and earned his nickname Benny the Stench for the foul odor that he produced. By 1967, Harvey Noto and his crew began to officially work under high-ranking Messina family soldier Umberto Lino. Lino, who was the father of Chucky Lino, took Harvey Noto under his wing and began to personally involve Noto in his dealings. Umberto Lino was considered second in command under Benny the Stench Grasso in the Huntington Street crew, which meant Noto and his crew were working under the upper crust of the family. During this period, Harvey Noto would make various debt collections for Lino, carry out acts of violence for Lino, and Noto was known to rotate with his close friend Chucky Lino as the driver and bodyguard for Umberto Lino. It was also believed that during this time Umberto Lino would use Harvey Noto to fix many professional baseball games, particularly with the Liberty City Swingers, and eventually Noto would gain a friendship with many figures within the Liberty City Swingers Baseball Club. Also during this time in 1967, the five families of Liberty City began to compete heavily for high-profile construction contracts, primarily in Algonquin. These construction jobs were extremely lucrative, and eventually this competition would create serious friction in the commission. 2 years prior to this, in 1965, Gambetti family boss and longtime friend of Mario Messina, Carlo Gambetti, had died of natural causes at age 74. By 1967, the Gambetti family was now being ran by 52-year-old mob legend out-of-Hove beach broker, Sonny Congelosi. Congelosi, who had long had positive business dealings with the Messina family, maintained an alliance with Mario Messina into his promotion as boss, and the Gambetti and Messina family would continue to pool their resources and hold significant power in Liberty City. During this time, the Messina family, Lupacella family, and Gambetti family would often align themselves together, and the Ancelotti family would try to cling onto the massively powerful Pavano family of Algonquin ran by Marco the typewriter Centrella and Cesario Charlie Valvona. Various leaders in the Ancelotti family over the years would however famously resent the Gambetti, Messina, and Lupacella families. Then in May of 1967, tensions would come to an all-time high for the Messinas and the Ancelottis when the Gambetti family would help high-ranking broker-based Messina soldier Frank the Guinea Gizzo bribed several city officials and obtained the contract to a multi-million-dollar construction project for the renovation of a low-rise hotel building at the corner of Columbus Avenue and Emerald Street in Lower Algonquin. The Ancelotti family had long referred to Columbus Avenue as their motherland in Liberty City, and based on this had long planned to reap the financial benefits of such a massive construction project in their territory. Additionally, the Messinas and Gambettis had just months prior obtained another highly lucrative construction contract in East Holland, another Ancelotti stronghold, and in response the commission had promised the Ancelottis a right to rig another high-profile construction bid. When the notorious leader of the Ancelotti family, 64-year-old Carlo the Rope Ancelotti, learned of his family's loss over the Columbus and Emerald project, Ancelotti became furious, and in a last-ditch effort to assert control over what he felt was being taken from him, Ancelotti would send several enforcers to an Earp Street social club in Schottler Broker operated by Frank the Guinea Gizzo's crew. The Ancelotti enforcers came with the message that Frank Gizzo was to hand over the Ancelottis 50% of the Columbus Avenue project, or war would ensue. While Frank the Guinea Gizzo was absent in the social club during this visit, several senior members of the Messina family's Earp Street crew were present, and a tension-filled standoff would ensue. When the Ancelotti enforcers would leave the club, one of the members of the Earp Street crew would open fire on their vehicle. And while no one was killed in this exchange, war was being waged in Liberty City. Just days later, Frank the Guinea Gizzo would be shot and killed at age 52 by Ancelotti hitmen while leaving a Beechwood City dentist's office. The hit would make major headlines around the city, and would mark the beginning of the Ancelotti-Messina War. The following day, Carlo the Rope Ancelotti would send his 37-year-old nephew from Naples, Italy, Giovanni Ancelotti, and his crew to rob the same Messina social club in Schottler, and the robbery crew would come away with roughly $80,000 cash, several firearms, and several pieces of expensive jewelry, taken directly from members of the Messina social club. The Messina family would strike back a week later when Mario Messina would send hitmen Rocco Rocky Slip Perilli and Salvatore Sally Shovels Lino to Carlo Ancelotti's three-story Lower Easton compound on Luddite Row. When Perilli and Lino arrived on Luddite Row, more than 100 rounds tore through Ancelotti's windows, and while Ancelotti was able to evade gunfire, his brother Dante Ancelotti was killed in the attack, and his youngest son Bruno Ancelotti was severely injured. While this move from the Messinas sent a powerful message to the Ancelottis, The hit would ultimately prove to be unsuccessful, as Carlo the Rope Ancelotti would survive and begin to plot a complete decimation of the Messina crime family. Shortly after, in September of 1967, legendary Messina family captain Franco the Fist Nunziata was shot and killed at age 75 in broad daylight outside of a Hooper Street pizzeria. The next day, Ancelotti gunmen would then shoot up Mario Messina's home on Bunker Hill Avenue in a move similar to that carried out at Carlo Ancelotti's home weeks prior. While Messina's home was significantly damaged, Mario Messina and his family had temporarily moved to luxurious East Island City apartment, and no one was in Messina's home at the time of the attack. The Ancelottis would, however, continue to plot the death of Mario Messina. In December of 1967, Mario Messina would meet with Sonny Congelosi of the Gambetti family and Charlie Valvona of the Pavano family at the Little Italy Leisure Center in Lower Algonquin. Valvona and Congelosi summoned Messina to this meeting to discuss his various commission violations during his ongoing war with the Ancelottis, and to persuade him to try and come to a resolution. Various construction-related topics were also discussed at this sit-down, which was held in the middle of the night to avoid attention. However, as Messina and his bodyguards left the meeting, they were tailed by an Ancelotti hit car. After the Ancelottis followed Messina for several blocks, the Ancelottis would finally send shots through Messina's windows on the corner of Garnett Street and Bismarck Avenue. All 4 passengers were shot in this attack. However, Messina and his driver, Joe D'Annunzio, were able to narrowly survive. Following this, 72-year-old Mario Messina, who was shot twice in the hip and shoulder, was briefly hospitalized at City Hall Hospital in Algonquin before being transferred to Schottler Medical Center and ultimately staying there for 4 weeks. When Mario Messina left Schottler Medical Center in a wheelchair in the early weeks of 1968, Messina and his family would move back and forth around several different apartments in Dukes, Broker, and Algonquin, as the Ancelotti-Messina war had now reached extreme levels. During Messina's recovery, both Sonny Congelosi of the Gambetti family and Marco the typewriter Centrella of the Pavano family would personally visit Mario Messina to show respect, and more importantly, to assure Mario Messina that the attempt on his life was solely the act of the Ancelotti family, and that the Gambettis and Pavanos played no role in trying to set him up. While this was in fact the truth, and the Ancelottis had acted alone, Mario Messina had grown weary of his counterparts in the commission, and began to distance himself from the very commission that he helped build. During this time, the Messina crime family continued to plot the execution of Carlo the Rope Ancelotti, who had become known in Liberty City by this point as the most traitorous and trigger-happy boss on the commission. In February of 1968, notorious Ancelotti crime family boss Carlo the Rope Ancelotti would attend a meeting in Schottler Broker to discuss union interests with members of the Gambetti and Lupacella crime families. After this sit-down, Carlo Ancelotti and several of his soldiers would attend an Italian restaurant, Tomasino's, in downtown Broker. As members of the Messina family would learn of Carlo Ancelotti's presence at this Montauk Avenue restaurant, enforcers would park up on the corner of Montauk Avenue and Cassidy Street, waiting for Ancelotti's exit. Eventually, Carlo the Rope Ancelotti would be hailed with gunfire outside of Tomasino's restaurant, and would be killed at age 65. Following this gangland execution, the Ancelotti family would appoint 37-year-old Carlo Ancelotti Jr. as the new don of the family. Carlo Ancelotti Jr., who was known on the street simply as Junior, was a tough man from the streets of Lower Easton, and was known to be a highly capable mobster. Junior Ancelotti and the rest of the Ancelotti crime family were now out for more blood, and the other 4 families at this time knew that this war needed to be stopped to restore order in Liberty City and within the commission. In April of 1968, Marco Centrella, Charlie Valvona, Vincent Lupacella, Peter Aiello, Mario Messina, and Vincent Scordo would all sit down with Junior Ancelotti and his advisors after hours in Fudz's Delicatessen in Lower Easton in a commission meeting. At this meeting, the commission offered Junior Ancelotti several high-profile construction projects for the companies they controlled. A construction company owned by the Messina family's Earp Street crew, and union interest in various areas of the city in exchange for a complete stand-down in the Ancelotti-Messina war. Junior Ancelotti, who was both devastated and bitter over the murder of his father, was also a man of greed, and the Ancelotti family would soon accept these conditions, ending the war. Soon after this, legendary Pavano family don Marco the typewriter Centrello would die at age 71 in Sicily. Several members of the Messina family would attend Centrella's funeral in Suffolk in June of 1968. In the summer of 1968, Mario Messina's son-in-law, little Jimmy Feccarazzo, obtained ownership of a major construction company based out of Broker and Algonquin. In the late months of 1968, Messina family associate Harvey Noto and his friends became involved in the drug business, an act that was punishable by death for inducted members of the Messina crime family. While Harvey Noto and his crew were not yet inducted soldiers, they were highly active associates that represented Umberto Lino, making their endeavor into drug distribution extremely risky. By 1969, Harvey Noto and his crew had become some of Duke's most prominent distributors of heroin, cocaine, marijuana, and various other drugs. The Harvey Noto crew would, however, use street gangs to move these drugs around Duke's, and would keep their involvement in the drug business under wraps. At some point during this time, the Noto crew would develop ties with the gangster King Street gang in Willis Dukes, and the Noto crew would be the main supplier of heroin for this gang. The Noto crew would also distribute drugs to the Hunter Street gang of Cerveza Heights, which was now being run by up-and-coming gangster Steve Wild, Stevie Mazza. Harvey Noto and his crew at this point were receiving drug shipments from suppliers in both Sicily and Colombia. While the Harvey Noto crew was not known to be on the street dealing drugs, by the end of 1969, their social club on the corner of Huntington Street and Camden Avenue in Cerveza Heights had become the headquarters for their drug operation, and various gang members and drug dealers would be seen appearing at this social club, usually leaving carrying large crates or briefcases. In March of 1970, Harvey Noto, Chucky Lino, Carmen Durazio, and several others would be arrested in a raid of the Huntington Social Athletic Club, where large amounts of heroin and cocaine were found in a safe that took the LCPD 4 hours to open. Eventually, Noto, Lino, and Durazio, who all shared in ownership over the social club, would all be sentenced to 10 years in Liberty State Correctional Facility for possession with intent to sell. Following this, Mario Messina, Umberto Lino, and the Messina family would turn their back on the Noto crew, and the bust would have a negative effect on the reputation of the powerful Umberto Lino, who initially brought this younger faction around the family. Over the course of the summer of 1970, various drug dealers across Dukes would be killed on the orders of the Messina family, as well as several Messina family soldiers and associates who were thought to be involved in drug distribution. Following years of gang violence in the Cerveza Heights neighborhood, which had consistently been one of Liberty City's highest crime areas, the rent in the neighborhood had become significantly lower than that of other Dukes neighborhoods. And during the early 1970s, racial demographics were quickly changing in Cerveza Heights, as an influx of Hispanic, Chinese, and Southeast Asian immigrants would begin to establish a presence in the once Italian enclave of Cerveza Heights. By 1972, while Italians made up 64% of the population in Cerveza Heights, Hispanics now made up 22% of the population, and Chinese and Southeast Asian immigrants, mostly from Laos, now made up 14% of the population in Cerveza Heights. While the Chinese and Southeast Asian immigrants that moved into Cerveza Heights during this time did not assimilate and mostly kept to themselves, the Hispanics in Cerveza Heights, who mostly came from Mexico, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, immediately began to make their presence known. Around 1972, the Spanish Lord Street Gang, a Hispanic street gang from South Bohun, had now opened territory on San Jacinto Avenue in Cerveza Heights, and this gang would quickly stir up trouble in the neighborhood, particularly with the Hunter Street Gang. As this was happening in the early 1970s, another Messina stronghold, Schottler Broker, was also experiencing cultural change. By 1972, the Earp Street section of Schottler Broker, which was formerly an Italian neighborhood ran by the Messinas, was now an African-American ghetto with several street gangs, including the Hustlers and Gangster Kings. By this point, Schottler Broker was known as one of the city's most violent and drug-addled areas. During this time, the former Earp Street crew, which was still being ran by the now 70-year-old Nick the Blade Finelli, would relocate to the South Slopes and Goatherd sections of Broker. In 1973, Longtime Messina family capo out of Steinway Dukes Sabino the Cigar Civello would die at age 83. Civello would be succeeded by 60-year-old Pete Petey Zuccarello in running the Messina family's Steinway regime on Morris Street. By this point, the Messina family's East Island City crew, formerly ran by Franco the Fist Nunziata, was now being ran by 69-year-old Joseph Joey Staines Alderizio. During this time in the 1970s, the Steinway and East Island City crews were both dwindling in numbers and struggling to earn, as the Messina family was beginning to show signs of regression. By the late 1970s, the main earners in the Messina family would be those who were able to profit from white-collar crime. At this point, Benny the Stench Grasso and Umberto Lino maintained control over all of the labor and transportation unions in Dukes, and held massive connections in the LCPD East Island City precinct. Benny the Stench Grasso was also responsible for controlling the Messina family's presence at Francis International Airport, where they controlled various cargo companies. The Huntington Street crew during this time was also involved in gambling, loan sharking, fencing, prostitution, and various forms of theft and extortion. By the late 1970s, Mario Messina's son-in-law, James Little Jimmy Feccarazzo, and his crew were rising to the top of the Messina family's broker faction, and Feccarazzo was known to have control over multiple highly successful legitimate businesses, multiple unions in Broker and Algonquin, the president of the Liberty City Transportation Authority, and several LCPD precincts, making him one of the most powerful rising stars in the Messina family. In summer of 1978, former Messina family associates Harvey Noto, Chucky Lino, and Carmen DiRazio were released on parole from Liberty State Correctional Facility. As the now 36-year-old Harvey Noto and friends returned to Cerveza Heights, Umberto Lino would make a push to accept Noto and his crew back into the family as associates and give them a second chance. However, Mario Messina would refuse this, and while some members of the family supported Umberto Lino in forgiving the Noto crew, certain members of the family were pushing to have them killed. Eventually, it seemed that Umberto Lino's relationship with Harvey Noto, Chucky Lino, and Carmen DiRazio was the only thing stopping them from being killed. During this time, Harvey Noto and his crew would remain in Cerveza Heights. However, Harvey Noto would in 1979 open a pizzeria on Manganese Street near Middle Park in Algonquin. This pizzeria would serve as Harvey Noto's headquarters for his bookmaking, loan sharking, and drug operations, which now spread from Dukes to Algonquin. As the Messina family hit the 1980s, they were a family ran by increasingly older men. In February of 1980, Messina family underboss Vincent "Vinny Bugs" Scordo would die at age 84, as Scordo would be succeeded as underboss by 71-year-old Massimo "Benny the Stench" Grasso. 63-year-old Umberto Lino would be appointed as capo over the Messina family's powerful Huntington Street crew in Cerveza Heights. By the year 1980, the now 85-year-old Mario Messina was still as sharp as ever despite his age. Messina at this point was the oldest mob boss in Liberty City and the last surviving member of the original commission. Messina during these years was still known as a fixture in Cerveza Heights and was beloved in his neighborhood. Messina at this point was being counseled by his cousin and longtime consigliere, 90-year-old Alphonse Bruno. At this point, Umberto Lino had become one of the family's most powerful figures, and Lino would help Messina, Bruno, and Grasso run the family from the top. By this point in 1980, Harvey Noto had become extremely wealthy, and his influence over his generation in Cerveza Heights couldn't be ignored. Many within the family felt he either had to be killed or become a member of the Messina family. Eventually, Umberto Lino and Mario Messina would once again accept Harvey Noto and his crew as associates of the Messina crime family, and Harvey Noto would swear to cease his involvement in the drug business. As this happened in the late months of 1980, Harvey Noto would become a top earner for Umberto Lino and the Messina crime family, and Harvey Noto and his crew would end any involvement with drugs, focusing on bookmaking, loan sharking, extortion, and rigging professional sports events. In spring of 1982, Liberty City business mogul Mark McCaskey developed a serious debt with Harvey Noto, which grew to more than $5 million with interest. McCaskey, who took out $1 million loan from Harvey Noto in 1980 to start a helicopter service company, found himself in 1982 unable to pay Noto, and with his life on the line. McCaskey, in a move of desperation, would sign Harvey Noto over the ownership of a $10 million high-rise hotel building in Middle Park, known as the Majestic Hotel. Harvey Noto, who paid for $5 million worth of the hotel, had obtained legitimate ownership in April of 1982, and following this the Majestic Hotel became Harvey Noto's Algonquin headquarters, and would soon make Noto extremely wealthy. During the summer of 1982, Harvey Noto put together many illegal operations in the Majestic Hotel, which from an outside perspective appeared as a respectable luxury hotel. However, on the hotel's top floors, several high-level gambling and prostitution operations were taking place under Noto's watch. During this time in summer of 1982, Harvey Noto would become acquainted with 34-year-old career criminal from Steinway Dukes, Harry Hall. Harry Hall, who was born to an Italian mother and an Irish father, would grow up on Trenton Avenue, and at a young age would join the Morris Street Boys gang, which was comprised mostly of Irish-American youth. By the early 1980s, Harry Hall was running a high-level prostitution racket in several exclusive Algonquin hotels. When Harvey Noto obtained ownership of the Majestic Hotel in April of 1982, Hall had already been running a lucrative escort service in the hotel for several years. By the end of 1982, Harry Hall was paying tribute to Harvey Noto, and the two developed a friendship. Harry Hall, who spoke fluent Italian, had many similarities with Harvey Noto and his crew, all of whom were from the streets of Dukes Liberty City. Soon Harry Hall would become a regular at a cafe on Huntington Street owned by Carmen D'Orazio and his father Francis, which served as the primary meeting place for the Harvey Noto crew, and was 2 doors down from Mario Messina's social club. And eventually Harry Hall would be personally introduced to Mario Messina. In the early months of 1983, it became apparent to Mario Messina that Harvey Noto was not only a serious earner and a capable gangster, but also a man of honor who was no longer involved in the drug business. It was around this time that Umberto Lino would push to have Harvey Noto and his son Chucky Lino inducted as made members of the Messina crime family. In March of 1983, at a ceremony held after hours in George's Italian restaurant on the corner of Huntington and Dukes, 41-year-old Harvey Noto and 38-year-old Chucky Lino would be officially inducted into the Messina crime family. In attendance was Mario Messina, Umberto Lino, Benny the Stench Grasso, and 93-year-old Messina family consigliere Alphonse Bruno, who would die just a month later. Following the loss of Al Bruno, Mario Messina would appoint his close friend and longtime soldier, 84-year-old Giacomo Jack Peeps Spano, as consigliere of the Messina family. Also in 1983, longtime captain over the Messina family's broker faction, Nicholas "Nick" the Blade Finelli would die at age 81. Finelli would be succeeded in his captain role by Mario Messina's 58-year-old son-in-law, James "Little Jimmy" Feccarazzo. As Mario Messina turned 89-year-old in 1984, he was beginning to lack energy, and the family was increasingly being ran by people like Benny the Stench and Jack Peeps. During this time in the early months of 1984, Umberto Lino, Chucky Lino, Harvey Noto, and Harry Hall began to plot a massive heist at the Francis International Airport which they controlled. This heist, which was planned over the course of several months, involved the robbery of a cargo building within Francis International Airport, which they knew to be containing valuables such as U.S. currency, gold, and jewelry. The heist, which was headed by Umberto Lino, was going to bring the Messina family back into prominence and help Umberto Lino, Harvey Noto's beloved mentor, get into the top ranks of the family, as Lino and the Huntington Street crew in Cerveza Heights were now struggling to compete with the broker faction of the family in kicking up to Mario Messina. After several months of planning and the bribery of several security guards and officials at Francis International Airport in December of 1984, Harvey Noto, Chucky Lino, Harry Hall, and Larry Scalise successfully stole $5 million cash from Francis International Airport, as well as another $1 million in jewelry. This heist, known as the Francis Airport Heist, was the most significant heist ever pulled off in Liberty City. While a brief chase ensued with LCPD squad cars that were called to the area, the crew eventually got away, and the robbery was never officially traced to the Messina crime family, despite long-time speculation. Soon after this, in January of 1985, the Messina family would be dealt an unexpected blow when Messina family underboss Massimo Benny the Stench Grasso would be arrested for shooting and killing his wife, While Mario Messina would hire many high-powered attorneys to defend Benny the Stench, it appeared the stench was going away. In the winter of 1985, during the time Benny the Stench Grasso was on trial, Mario Messina began to decline in health, and it became apparent in the family that the Messina family would eventually be naming a new boss. In May of 1985, Mario Messina, longtime Messina family crime boss, would die at age 90. The loss of the legendary Mario Messina would be felt around the city, as the last original commission boss was now gone. In the days before Messina's death, with underboss Benny the Stench Grasso going away to Liberty State Correctional Facility, Mario Messina would appoint his son-in-law, James Little Jimmy Feccarazzo, to succeed him as Don of the Messina crime family. While Feccarazzo seemed like a logical successor to Mario Messina, many in the family were surprised and deeply disappointed that 68-year-old Umberto Lino was not named the boss. The Harvey Noto crew, who had been mentored by Umberto Lino and held him in the highest regard, were said to be livid at Jimmy Feccarazzo's promotion as boss, feeling Lino should have taken the role. During this time, a divide was beginning to grow within the Messina family, between the broker faction of the family that was now in power and the historical Dukes faction of the family. As 60-year-old Jimmy Feccarazzo became the boss in spring of 1985, Feccarazzo would name his 50-year-old driver, Paul D'Andrea, as underboss of the family, and 68-year-old Salvatore, Max DiPicello, would be named Feccarazzo's consigliere. These two were both based out of the broker faction. For the remainder of 1985 into 1986, as little Jimmy Feccarazzo would inherit the interests of his father-in-law, many Messina members based out of Dukes would gain a resentment for Jimmy Feccarazzo and the family's new regime. Feccarazzo was known as a white-collar racketeer, rather than a street-oriented gangster, and this did not impress members of the Messina family, who were ruthless and hardened criminals. Despite this, Jimmy Feccarazzo was a longtime power player and had to be respected. At some point in 1986, unbeknownst to the administration of the Messina crime family, Harvey Noto and members of his crew would once again become involved in drug distribution, particularly at the Majestic Hotel. At this point in 1986, every other family in Liberty City was involved in drug distribution. However, Jimmy Feccarazzo still maintained the position of his late father-in-law. In 1986, the captains out of Dukes were Umberto Lino, Harvey Noto, and Joe the Cook Pizzono. The captains out of Broker were Joe Zerko, Frankie Meatballs D'Andrea, and Paul Polly Horsecock Sisterino. By this point in 1986, with members of the Umberto Lino and Joe Pizzono crews now have comprised mostly of senior citizens, the younger Noto crew was now overwhelmingly the most powerful crew out of Dukes, and Harvey Noto was at this point the highest earning and most powerful capo in the family. In the late months of 1986, Umberto Lino became sick with cancer. During this time, 63-year-old heavyweight Carlo Tomasone would take control of Lino's legendary Huntington Street regime. Also during this time, rumors of the Harvey Noto crew's involvement in drug distribution would reach the ears of the administration of the family. For the beginning of 1987, little Jimmy Feccarazzo and his underboss Paul D'Andrea were closely watching the Noto crew, and tensions were rising. At some point in spring of 1987, at a sit-down in Alderney, Harvey Noto and Chucky Lino would be confronted by the administration about their crew's involvement in drugs. Noto and Lino would aggressively deny these claims. And following this, many members of the Noto crew, including Harvey Noto, no longer wanted to acknowledge Feccarazzo as their boss. Around this time, the Noto crew would consider taking out Feccarazzo and his affiliates, and appointing Umberto Lino as new Don of the family. However, at this point Umberto Lino, who was nearly on his deathbed, would discourage this, and urge Noto to respect the late Mario Messina's wishes. In August of 1987, legendary Huntington Street capo Umberto Lino would die of cancer at age 70. When Lino's funeral was held in downtown Broker, representatives from all 5 families were in attendance, as well as various city officials and professional sports figures. However, absent from the funeral was Messina family boss Jimmy Feccarazzo and underboss Paul D'Andrea. While Feccarazzo and D'Andrea would avoid this funeral to avoid public attention, Huntington Street was livid at what they felt was disrespect against a Messina legend. In particular, Harvey Noto and Chucky Lino were enraged with Feccarazzo, And it was at this point that Harvey Noto began to plan a takeover of the Messina crime family. During the fall of 1987, Harvey Noto, Chucky Lino, and Harry Hall, all of whom were at risk of being killed by their own family for their involvement in drugs, would come together in secrecy to plan the killing of Jimmy Feccarazzo, Paul D'Andrea, and possibly several others. During this time, only Noto, Lino, and Hall were involved, and the plot was considered top secret. The three planned to first take out their bosses, and then divide the family from there, killing off any opposers and taking over whatever is left. During the late months of 1987, Noto, Lino, and Hall were now actively looking for a good time to get Feccarazzo and D'Andrea in the same place at the same time. Because Feccarazzo and D'Andrea both lived in Alderney mansions, the original plan was to carry out the hit in Alderney. However, eventually, as winter of 1987 came, Harvey Noto would become aware of a high-profile New Year's Eve party that Feccarazzo and D'Andrea were likely to attend. The party was to be held in Star Junction just next door to the Majestic, at the Emissary Hotel, and was being held by Feccarazzo's close affiliates in the unions. In December of 1987, when Feccarazzo and D'Andrea were confirmed to be attending the event, Noto, Lino, and Hall began to put the final plan together. The crew planned to have 4 triggermen, each armed with sawed-off-style shotguns, while Harvey Noto and Chucky Lino would be parked in a car a block away watching. They planned to have the triggermen ambush Feccarazzo and D'Andrea as they exited onto Nickel Street, as well as anyone who gets in their way. The crew would then have a getaway driver on standby to quickly pick up the 4 triggermen in a 4-door modified getaway car, all while Noto and Lino watch from down the block. The hit, while carefully planned and well thought out, was an extremely brazen plan to be carried out on New Year's Eve in the middle of Star Junction. However, the Noto crew knew they had to strike fast. In the weeks preceding New Year's Eve, Noto would choose his trusted crew members, Harry Hall, Carmen DiRazio, Larry Scalise, and Sam Prato as triggermen for the hit, and Chucky Lino's younger brother Johnny Lino as getaway driver. Harvey Noto and Chucky Lino would plan to also be armed in their watch car in case anything went south. Leading up to this hit, only the men taking part were aware of the plan. The rest of the Messina family was left completely in the dark. As New Year's Eve approached, the crew went into action. At around 10 p.m., little Jimmy Feccarazzo and Paul D'Andrea would arrive at the Emissary Hotel on Nickel Street in D'Andrea's black Ubermarkt Sentinel. Parked in a nondescriptive Willard Marbell on the corner of Nickel Street and Columbus Avenue was Harvey Noto and Chucky Lino, who watched their 2 bosses make their entrance. Soon after, Harry Hall, Carmen DiRazio, Larry Scalise, and Sam Prato would all arrive in a black Dunleary Virgo on Columbus Avenue and Nickel Street, dressed in trench coats and fedora-style hats, and armed with sawed-off-style shotguns. Also parked on Columbus Avenue back near Obsidian Street was getaway driver Johnny Lino in a turbo-boosted 4-door black Albany Emperor. Harry Hall and Johnny Lino were both carrying walkie-talkies that connected each of them directly to Harvey Noto in the watch car. Eventually, Noto would direct Harry Hall and the triggermen to exit their car on Columbus Avenue and wait in Middle Park across the street from the emissary doors on Nickel Street. From here, the 4 triggermen would wait for Feccarazzo and D'Andrea to make their exit and ambush on site. Then, just minutes after the balls dropped, 63-year-old Jimmy Feccarazzo and 53-year-old Paul D'Andrea would make their exit onto Nickel Street towards D'Andrea's Ubermarkt. Seemingly out of nowhere, Harry Hall, Carmen DiRazio, Larry Scalise, and Sam Prato, all dressed in long trench coats of fedora hats, and armed with sawed-off shotguns, would run out from Middle Park and ambush Feccarazzo and D'Andrea with multiple close-range shotgun blasts. Feccarazzo, the boss, and D'Andrea, the underboss, were devastated by these shots, both of them having their faces blasted off in what would become known as one of the most brazen and gruesome gangland killings of its time in Liberty City. As this was happening, Johnny Lino would pull up in the getaway car, and the 4 gunmen would be quickly escorted out of the area. As a shocked crowd gathered around Nickel Street to see what had happened, Harvey Noto and Chucky Lino would drive past the emissary, seeing their former bosses now laying in the street and surrounded in their own blood. Shockwaves would be immediately sent through the Messina crime family following this hit. As the Noto crew drove back to Huntington Street, a large meeting was held with all 3 Dukes-based crews of the family in Francis DiRazio's cafe. In this meeting, Harvey Noto made it clear that he was taking over the Messina crime family and willing to kill anyone in his way. The old-school Dukes-based crews, who had previously shared Noto's resentment for Feccarazzo, were now fully on board with Noto, and the younger faction of the family led by Harvey Noto and Chucky Lino was now gearing up for war with the broker faction of the family. Word would quickly spread in the Liberty City underworld that Harvey Noto was behind the Feccarazzo hit, and that he was calling himself the new Messina family Don. In Broker, a younger crew, led by 45-year-old Paul "Polyhorse Cock" Sistorino, was already aligning themselves with the Harvey Noto regime. The Polyhorse Cock Sistorino crew operated out of the Rotterdam Hill, BOABO, and Hedgesbury sections of Broker, and were a highly lucrative street crew. However, two massive street crews in Broker were planning to go to war with Noto. These crews were led by 66-year-old Joey Zerko, who was a lifelong friend of little Jimmy Feccarazzo, and Paul DeAndreas's 58-year-old brother, Frank DeAndrea, who swore revenge for the murder of his brother. Soon after this, 45-year-old Harvey Noto, the new Messina family Don, would throw a massive party at George's Italian restaurant in Cerveza Heights on the corner of Huntington Street and Dukes Boulevard. Present at this restaurant were multiple players from the Liberty City Swingers baseball team and the Liberty City Wrath football team, multiple boxers, singers, actors, union officials, city officials, and of course, Harvey Noto's vast network of criminal associates. The event marked Harvey Noto's official inauguration as boss of the Messina crime family. In the years leading up to this point, Harvey Noto had developed a friendship with many figures within the Gambetti crime family, including 65-year-old Gambetti family boss John Gravelli. Noto was also a longtime friend of high-ranking Lupicella family capo, Angelo Lolo Lupicella, and his son Mark Lupicella, as well as various members of their crew in Little Bay Bohan. Additionally, Harvey Noto had longtime ties to the Paul Matisse crew of the Pavano family that was based out of East Holland and parts of Alderney. Despite Harvey Noto's widespread connections, problems would eventually rise for Harvey Noto from within the commission. At this point, the broker faction of the Messina crime family, that was now being headed by Joey Zerko and Frank DeAndrea, was attempting to have the commission take out Harvey Noto. Within the commission, Pavano family boss Joe Valvona and Ancelotti family boss Giovanni Ancelotti were both in support of killing Harvey Noto and various members of his crew for the murder of commission members Jimmy Feccarazzo and Paul DeAndrea. However, John Gravelli and Vincent Lupicella were neutral in the matter. Eventually, in May of 1988, in one of the most notorious gang land shootings in Duke's history, newly appointed Messina family Don Harvey Noto and his close friend Larry Scalise would be hailed with gunfire in front of the cafe on Huntington Street. While Harvey Noto would survive with a minor shot in the leg, Lorenzo Larry Snuff Scalise would later die in Schockler Medical Center from multiple fatal gunshot wounds at age 45. It was immediately clear that this was carried out by the orders of Joey Zerko and Frank DeAndrea of the broker faction of the family, and war was officially waged. Following the 1988 shooting on Huntington Street, the broker faction of the family was now operating mostly out of Alderney, in connection with the Alderney-based Pegorino crime family. This crew, led by Joey Zerko and Frank DeAndrea, was laying low and were not seen around Broker or Dukes. Despite the loss of Larry Snuff, a Huntington Street native and longtime friend of Harvey Noto, the Harvey Noto regime in Dukes was undeniably the more powerful faction of the family, and Harvey Noto was being recognized around the city as new Messina family Don. Noto, who was one of the most wealthy figures in the entire Messina family, had appointed his right-hand man since childhood, 43-year-old Fat Chucky Lino, as underboss of the family. And despite 40-year-old Harry Hall's Irish heritage, Hall would be put in an advisory position in the family due to his close affiliation with Harvey Noto. In the street, Noto had several crews. The new Huntington Street crew that was ran by Carmen Beans DiRazio and Johnny Lino. A highly profitable bookmaking crew that was led by Peter Staples Iozzo and Anthony Tony Cannoli Perilli. A crew in Broker led by Polly Horsecock Sistorino. And Noto still had many elderly maid members of the family that were loyal to him and still held power in Liberty City. Noto also had a younger up-and-coming crew led by 25-year-old Mark Volpe. This crew was known to be highly profitable in bookmaking, loan sharking, drug and arms trafficking, and the fencing of stolen goods. Mark Volpe, who was born and raised on Huntington Street in Cerveza Heights, was the son of notorious former Messina family figure, Anthony Two Guns Volpe, who was killed in the early 70s under mysterious circumstances. Mark Volpe, along with his younger brother Fredo, were known as some of the main rising stars in Cerveza Heights at the time, and in 1988, Mark Volpe was officially inducted into the Messina family at age 25 by Harvey Noto. By 1989, Messina family Don Harvey Noto would move with his wife and 2 young sons into a luxury home on Stillwater Avenue in the upscale Dukes neighborhood of Meadow Hills. This Meadow Hills home was coincidentally next door to the legendary Gravelli compound, which would closely tie Harvey Noto with John Gravelli and his family for many years to come, as well as the Gambetti family's Stillwater Avenue crew. In the early months of 1990, Harvey Noto and the Messina family would strike back against the broker faction when their leader, Joey Zerko, was shot and killed outside of his home in Bircham, Alderney, by shooters Harry Hall and Carmen DeRazio. Weeks later, the new Messina regime would make another power play when longtime broker heavyweight Frank D'Andrea was shot and killed with his son and nephew in Leftwood, Alderney. By this point, in the early months of 1990, the remaining Feckerazzo loyalists were now inactive in the Messina family, and several of their associates would be absorbed into the Pegorino family of Alderney. It was around this time that Harvey Noto would be officially recognized within the commission as the boss of the Messina crime family. Around this time in 1990, in the Cerveza Heights neighborhood, a 25-year-old Sicilian immigrant, Vito Centraccio, would begin to make a name for himself as a major heroin dealer. Vito Centraccio and his younger brother Carlo Centraccio, who were originally tied to an organized crime family in Sicily, had arrived in Liberty City in 1988, settling on Charleston Avenue in Cerveza Heights. By 1990, Vito Centraccio was receiving massive heroin shipments to Liberty City through his connections in Sicily, and was making serious money operating independently. Around this time, Vito Centraccio would open a social club in Cerveza Heights on the corner of Huntington Street and Charleston Avenue, known as the Charleston Avenue Lounge, and Centraccio would develop a small crew of Sicilian-born affiliates. Centraccio, who was keeping a low profile in Cerveza Heights, would eventually befriend someone called Dean DeRazio. Dean DeRazio, who lived in an apartment on Charleston Avenue, was the son of Messina family heavyweight Carmen DeRazio, and this would begin Vito Centraccio's affiliation with the Messina crime family. Eventually, Vito Centraccio would be forced to pay tribute to Carmen DeRazio, and Centraccio would begin to perform small tasks for the Huntington Street crew. Also around this time, the Mark Volpe crew had become one of the most profitable street crews in all of Dukes, and many of his soldiers were getting inducted into the family. It was also around this time that the Volpe crew would inherit Harvey Noto's connections in professional baseball, and the Volpe crew would begin to fix many professional baseball games to aid their high-level gambling rings. In the late months of 1990, Harvey Noto, who had a net worth of nearly $1 billion, would invest in full ownership of another Algonquin high-rise, the Opium Knights Hotel in Middle Park East. This hotel, which had been controlled by Harry Hall and the Messinas for years prior to their ownership, would become a major headquarters for various Messina family endeavors. By this point in the early 1990s, it seemed Harvey Noto had taken the Messina family from a shrinking group of mostly elderly members to one of the most successful crime families in the entire Liberty City metropolitan area. In 1991, 43-year-old Harry Hall, who had become extremely wealthy over his years in the drug and prostitution businesses, would graduate from Vespucci Law School and would obtain a Liberty Law license. Harvey Noto planned to use Harry Hall, who had no considerable criminal record, as a legal advisor for the family, who could represent them if need be. In 1993, the FIB would bring a widespread extortion case onto the Messina crime family for their involvement in labor and transportation union extortion. The FIB would attempt to bring down Harvey Noto and Chucky Lino, as well as Mark and Fredo Volpe and various members of the Volpe crew. While the family's lawyer, Harry Hall, would quickly get all charges dropped against Harvey Noto and Chucky Lino, neither of whom had any direct evidence against them. Eventually, Mark Volpe and his brother Fredo would be charged with union extortion for their direct role in taking over a Dukes labor union. The Volpe brothers would ultimately serve less than a year in Liberty State Correctional Facility. As the Volpe brothers returned to the Dukes streets in the early weeks of 1994, their powerful crew had lost no traction, and the two would be welcomed back to Cerveza Heights as two of the most respected rising mobsters in Liberty City. Soon after this, in February of 1994, Fredo Volpe would be officially inducted into the Messina crime family at age 28. At this point in 1994, Harvey Noto was operating out of the cafe on Huntington Street, along with the historical Huntington Street crew. Noto, by this point, was often represented by Chucky Lino and Harry Hall. Harry Hall, while serving as the family's consigliere, was also operating a crew in Algonquin out of the Majestic and Opium Nights hotels. And this crew was made up of members of both the Huntington Street crew and the Volpe crew. The Volpe crew at this point was operating highly lucrative bookmaking operations all around the Liberty City metropolitan area. And the crew's leader, Mark Volpe, in April of 1994 would open a strip club called Pillows Nightclub on Huntington Street in Cerveza Heights that would serve as the crew's headquarters. The Messinas had another serious gambling crew ran by Peter Staples Iozzo and Anthony Tony Cannoli Perilli. This crew operated out of a Morris Street bookmaking office in Steinway Dukes. In Broker, the Messinas had a crew led by Paul Polly Horsecock Sisterino that controlled Harvey Noto's broker influence. Finally, the Messinas now also had an up-and-coming Sicilian crew in Cerveza Heights on Charleston Avenue, led by Vito Centraccio. This crew, that regularly spoke in Sicilian rather than English, operated a high-level heroin trafficking ring out of Vito Centraccio's Charleston Avenue lounge. In August of 1994, a Cerveza Heights drug dealer named Vito Marino developed a serious debt with Mark Volpe. Marino, who had been extorted by Mark Volpe and his crew since 1990, had in July of 1994 decided to refuse street tax payments to Mark Volpe. After Marino was warned several times by members of Mark Volpe's crew, Marino had become a marked man in the neighborhood. Eventually, in August of 1994, Mark Volpe and Vito Marino would find themselves next to each other in traffic on Dukes Boulevard. As Mark Volpe spotted Marino in his car, and Volpe attempted to cut off Marino, eventually Marino would lead Volpe on a chase around Cerveza Heights, before Marino would fatally crash his car into the LCPD East Island City Precinct on Livingston Street. The crash would immediately create a stir around the neighborhood, and eventually Mark Volpe would be charged with manslaughter in connection with the crash. In September of 1994, Harry Hall would begin to represent Mark Volpe in this case, and Hall would put together a strong defense. Charges against Volpe would eventually be dropped in December of 1994, and Harry Hall would earn his second major legal victory for the Messinas. In 1995, Harvey Noto and Harry Hall began to lose trust in broker-based capo Polly Horsecock Sisterino, after rumors began to circulate that Sisterino was an informant. In February of 1995, Harvey Noto would order several of his captains to report to the cafe on Huntington Street, including Carmen D'Orazio, Mark Volpe, Harry Hall, and Polly Sisterino. When Polly Sisterino arrived on Huntington Street, he was led to the back of the cafe, where he would eventually be violently attacked by Noto, D'Orazio, Hall, and Volpe. After a brutal beating, Sisterino would be interrogated by Noto, D'Orazio, Hall, and Volpe for over an hour. In the course of the interrogation, Sisterino was viciously tortured with a blowtorch and several saws. And before Sisterino was killed, he would be severely cut, burned, bludgeoned, and even castrated. These violent methods were not uncommon for Harvey Noto and the Messinas, and it seemed as time went on these sort of heinous scenes would become more and more common. Following this, Harvey Noto would have the Mark Volpe crew take over Sisterino's various broker-based rackets, and Mark Volpe's influence would continue to grow. Also around this time, in July of 1995, Vito Centraccio, Carlo Centraccio, and Dean D'Orazio would be assigned directly by Harvey Noto to carry out the interrogation of another alleged Messina informant, Louis Pellegrino. The Centraccio brothers, who along with their closest crew member Dean D'Orazio, had already been involved in numerous murders for the Messina family, were now being considered for induction as made members, and carrying out these sort of violent acts was the best way to boost themselves in the eyes of Harvey Noto and the Messina crime family. Eventually, in July of 1995, Vito Centraccio, Carlo Centraccio, and Dean D'Orazio would kidnap Louis Pellegrino from his home in Steinway, before bringing him to Harvey Noto at the cafe on Huntington Street. At the cafe, Vito Centraccio, Carlo Centraccio, and Dean D'Orazio, along with Harvey Noto and Harry Hall, would carry out extreme torture against Pellegrino before killing him. Vito Centraccio, who was especially dark and sadistic in his violence, was impressive to Noto and Hall, who saw him as a dangerous killer like themselves. Vito Centraccio was also known for his stoic and emotionless demeanor, and this paired with his extreme violent tendencies would make him one of Liberty City's most feared killers. In August of 1995, at a meeting held at the cafe on Huntington Street, Vito Centraccio, Carlo Centraccio, and Dean D'Orazio would all be officially inducted as made members of the Messina crime family by Harvey Noto and Chucky Lino. The younger Centraccio crew that operated out of the Charleston Avenue Lounge represented the old-school Messina family, as these were modern-day young Sicilian immigrants still speaking the Sicilian dialect. By 1996, the Pillows nightclub, while serving as the primary headquarters for the Volpe crew, had become somewhat of a popular strip club for Duke's residents. In March of 1996, an incident took place at Pillows where Mark Volpe and his associate, Rocco Folligento, would brutally beat a patron to death after the patron allegedly disrespected Volpe. Soon after, in March of 1996, Mark Volpe would once again be charged with manslaughter. Following this, Harvey Noto would have Harry Hall once again represent Volpe. However, Noto was said to be livid with Volpe and his irresponsible behavior. While Harry Hall was able to get Volpe's sentence greatly reduced, in May of 1996, Mark Volpe would be sentenced to 5 years in Liberty State Correctional Facility. As Mark Volpe was sent away, Harvey Noto would promote Fredo Volpe as acting capo over the massive Volpe crew. In the early months of 1998, Mark Volpe would be released from Liberty State Correctional Facility on parole after serving just over a year. As Volpe returned to Cerveza Heights, he would return to a thriving street crew led by his brother Fredo Volpe, who was a long-time drug dealer. Soon after his release, Mark Volpe would move with his wife and young children into a spacious 3-flat on Savannah Avenue in Meadows Park, Dukes. By 1998, it seemed like the Messinas were a growing family destined for years of success. However, trouble was about to unfold. In May of 1998, Fredo Volpe would be arrested in East Hookbroker by FIB agents that had been following him for up to a year. Volpe, at the time of this arrest, had been found with roughly $1 million worth of horse tranquilizer, a popular street drug that Fredo Volpe and his crew were distributing to various smaller drug gangs around Liberty City. When the FIB agents took Fredo Volpe into custody, the agents would have Volpe listen to various tape recordings they collected of Messina crime family higher-ups, including Harvey Noto, Chucky Lino, and Harry Hall. In these recordings, Noto, Lino, and Hall, as well as others, repeatedly talked down on Fredo Volpe, as well as his brother Mark, and discussed the possibility of their cooperation with authorities. In one particular recording, Harvey Noto and Harry Hall were heard describing to Capo Vito Centraccio how they wanted him to torture and castrate Fredo Volpe because they felt he might be an informant. Fredo Volpe, upon hearing these tapes, became extremely distressed and was said to have defecated on himself at the FIB office in upstate Liberty. Volpe knew that although he had never been an informant, all it took was the suspicion in the eyes of Harvey Noto and the Messinas, and Volpe could find himself in an unthinkable world of pain and torture. Like many suspected informants before him, it was at this point that Fredo Volpe would break his oath with the Messina crime family and become a confidential informant. The FIB from this point, who was threatening Volpe with a maximum of 40 years in federal prison for his drug-dealing ring, was able to use Fredo Volpe as a confidential asset to take down the Messina crime family, while he was quietly released to the street. Following Volpe's encounter with the FIB, Volpe would report back to the Pillows nightclub on Huntington Street the following day, and not a soul in the family besides himself had any idea of what had happened. Fredo Volpe never had the dedication to Harvey Noto and the Messina family that his brother Mark had. Volpe, despite being paranoid at first about the situation, would soon fit comfortably into the role of a confidential informant, and would become a model informant for the FIB. The FIB planned to use Volpe for many years to come and build a widespread case against the Messina crime family, rather than making the first arrests they possibly could. So by the summer of 1998, the FIB regularly had Fredo Volpe wired for sound, going through his days as a high-ranking Messina family soldier. The FIB would also regularly coach Volpe on how they wanted him to interact with various Messina family figures, including Harvey Noto, to try to get the most incriminating evidence they could on recording. The FIB, who was known to despise mafia figures, had a special hatred for Harvey Noto, and at this point Noto and his affiliates were of the FIB's top concern. It also became apparent around this time that while Volpe's life was coming into question on FIB recordings, Fredo Volpe had remained on good standings with Harvey Noto and the Messina family. In August of 1998, unrelated to Fredo Volpe's cooperation, Mark Volpe would be pulled over in Algonquin, and upon a vehicle inspection, several gambling records were found from Mark Volpe's widespread sportsbook. Volpe would subsequently be charged and would plead guilty to promoting gambling, and return to Liberty State Correctional Facility on another 5-year sentence. With Mark Volpe out of the picture, Fredo Volpe would once again step in as acting capo over the Messina family's Volpe crew. Soon, Fredo Volpe, who was a man of deep greed, would realize that he could use his informant status to take out his rivals in the Messina family. Subsequently, in October of 1998, high-ranking Huntington Street soldiers Johnny Lino, John Prado, and Carlo Tomasone would be taken down on a racketeering case put together by Fredo Volpe and the FIB. Also included in this racketeering case were longtime Huntington Street soldiers Vincent D. Castro, Anthony D. Castro, and Vincent Dadone. This racketeering case would take out a significant piece of the core of the historical Huntington Street crew, particularly their gambling operation, which had strongholds over the fixing of professional sports games dating back several decades. Not long after this, in March of 1999, Fredo Volpe would help the FIB build a case against 3 of his own crew's top earners, Phil Ballesteri, Fred Dadone, and Jimmy Cross. These 3 were some of the city's most lucrative bookmakers at the time, and in past years had become higher earners than Fredo Volpe, which caused Volpe to resent them and be pleased when they were sentenced to 7 years in a gambling case. For the rest of 1999, while the Messinas were dealing with constant indictments, Fredo Volpe was rising to be one of the family's top earners. As the Messinas headed into the 21st century, they had genuinely become one of Liberty City's most powerful families, rivaled only by the Pavanos and Gambettis. However, everyone knew there was a rat in the family. This would be an era of paranoia for the family, a theme that would stay with them for years to come, as various members across the family would be accused of being a rat. In July of 2000, Mark Volpe would be released from prison once again and would retain his capo position in the family. While the FIB planned to take a slow, methodical approach in their use of Fredo Volpe to eventually take down the top bosses, they were also enjoying making small busts. In 2001, Steinway-based Messina soldier John Iozzo would be sentenced to 30 years in prison for his involvement in a heroin ring dating back to the early 90s. This was again thanks to the cooperation of confidential informant Fredo Volpe. Despite all of these legal problems, the top bosses of the Messina family were living well. Harvey Noto had reached unthinkable levels of wealth, and in 2002, Harvey Noto would purchase $1 million Anus Cognoscenti, one of the era's most extravagant luxury cars. Also around this time, Noto would purchase a summer home in the Caraways for him and his family. And soon, many Messina family figures, including Chucky Lino and Harry Hall, would congregate in the Caraways during the summer. When Harvey Noto wasn't in the Caraways, he remained with his family in his Stillwater Avenue home, just a few blocks outside of his Cerveza Heights stronghold. By this point in 2002, Fredo Volpe was seen as a respected Messina family heavyweight, and his informant status was unknown. However, Volpe remained an active informant. Volpe at this point was racking up hours upon hours worth of recordings against Messina family figures, including Harvey Noto, Chucky Lino, and Harry Hall, as well as his brother Mark and various members of the Volpe crew. Then, one night in August of 2002, Messina family soldier Vincent Foligno would coincidentally observe Fredo Volpe meeting what appeared to be FIB agents on Charge Island. As Vincent Foligno would begin to spread this rumor, the rumor would eventually reach the ears of the Volpe brothers. Enraged, Mark Volpe would find Vincent Foligno on the street in Cerveza Heights and would accost him and violently beat him before ultimately slicing his tongue out of his mouth to defend his brother's name. Vincent Foligno would survive, however would suffer permanent damage from the attack. At this point, with Foligno missing his tongue, Fredo Volpe's secret was safe. However, from this point on in summer of 2002, both Mark and Fredo Volpi would be commonly accused of being rats within Messina circles. By 2003, Noto, Lino, and Hall were closely watching the Volpi brothers, and despite rumors, the Messina administration ultimately doubted their cooperation and continued to involve them in their dealings. In April of 2003, Harvey Noto and Harry Hall would become convinced that longtime Volpi crew soldier Anthony Resto was an informant. Resto, who was involved in various rackets, ran out of the Opium Knights Hotel, was arrested for heroin distribution at the hotel in March of 2003, before being subsequently released the next day. Resto, who was also an FIB asset unbeknownst to Fredo Volpi, was now greatly under the suspicion of the Messina family. Then one night in April 2003, Harvey Noto, Harry Hall, Mark Volpi, Fredo Volpi, and Anthony Resto would drive out to a warehouse in East Hook Broker. In this warehouse, Harvey Noto and Harry Hall, along with the Volpi brothers, would interrogate Resto, carrying out extreme torture before ultimately killing Resto at age 37. While Fredo Volpi was not wired for this murder, Volpi would later describe the scene for FIB in great detail. In November of 2004, Fredo Volpi, along with Huntington Street crew members Patty Tallarico and Rob Balsamo, would receive direct orders from Harvey Noto to do a hit on Liberty City Swingers owner Martin Fagina. The hit would be carried out in December of 2004 when Volpi, Tallarico, and Balsamo would kidnap Fagina and eventually throw him out of a helicopter into the ocean. Then in summer of 2006, suspicion within the family would arise about Fredo Volpi when his soldiers Tallarico and Balsamo would be charged for the murder they were ordered to commit with Fredo Volpi. Then months later, more soldiers from the Volpi crew would go down, this time in a bookmaking ring ran by Mark Volpi. With the many busts surrounding the Volpi crew, Mark and Fredo Volpi were continuously being left out of any prosecution, and many soldiers within the Messina family were becoming highly skeptical of both Volpi brothers. By 2007, the Huntington Street crew ran by Carmen D'Orazio, as well as the Charleston Avenue crew ran by Vito Centraccio, were avoiding the Volpi crew altogether, and the Volpis were quickly losing their credibility and becoming endangered. At one point in early 2007, Volpi crew soldiers Phil Ballesteri and Vito Monteleone would catch Fredo Volpi adjusting his wire while he recorded them discussing crimes, and the two would bring the information straight to Harvey Noto. By this point, Harvey Noto, Chucky Lino, and Harry Hall were panicking, knowing the Volpi brothers had to go and fearing for how much information the government might have gotten. Finally, in October of 2007, Vito Centraccio and his crew would kidnap both Mark and Fredo Volpi on the orders of Harvey Noto, bringing them to a Messina-owned warehouse in East Hook Broker. Waiting in the warehouse was Harvey Noto, Chucky Lino, and Harry Hall. When the Volpi brothers were brought to the warehouse, Fredo Volpi was said to have once again defecated on himself. In the East Hook warehouse, the Volpi brothers would be brutally tortured and interrogated. While Fredo Volpi was a confidential informant, his brother Mark was truly a dedicated mobster, and one of Harvey Noto's greatest earners ever. However, rumors about both of the brothers being rats had been circulating for years, and Mark Volpi was ultimately considered guilty by association. After Harvey Noto, Chucky Lino, Harry Hall, and Vito Centraccio brutally tortured and killed the Volpi brothers in typical Messina family fashion, the group of four would then bring the bodies of the Volpi brothers onto a boat before leaving them at sea. With the Volpi brothers now gone, the Messinas would go through a major reorganization going into the year 2008. Harvey Noto would place the majority of Volpi crew members under the Vito Centraccio crew, and by this point the now 42-year-old Vito Centraccio had rose to one of the family's key figures. Also at this point, high-ranking Messina soldiers Peter Staples Iozzo, Tony Cannoli Perilli, and Vinny Bread Iozzo would be charged on a racketeering case for their highly lucrative sports gambling ring. This was again a result of the late Fredo Volpi. With this happening, members of the Iozzo crew would be absorbed into the Huntington Street crew that was now being ran by Capo Johnny Lino. In the late months of 2007, rumors began to circulate of upcoming indictments against Noto, Lino, and Hall, as well as other Messina family figures, and it became apparent that Fredo Volpi, who was considered missing by the LCPD, had collected seriously incriminating evidence against the Messina crime family. and Harry Hall at the time began to plan the family's legal defense. In December of 2007, Harvey Noto, who the FIB was building a case against, would sell his Stillwater Avenue home and would discreetly move with his wife and youngest son to Sicily. From this point on, the now 66-year-old Harvey Noto would run the Messina crime family from Sicily, and various Messina family figures, including Harry Hall, would frequently fly to Sicily to meet with Noto. In the early months of 2008, Algonquin's two major thoroughfares, Frankfort Avenue and Columbus Avenue, were both set to undergo major renovation. Soon after these projects were announced, Chucky Lino and Harry Hall would use their connections in libel and in the unions to take over the highly lucrative Columbus Avenue project, while the Pavano family would take control of the Frankfort Avenue project. As construction began in early 2008, Columbus Avenue would be fully blocked off from Jade Street to Iron Street and Libel, or the Liberty Electrical Company would begin work. The job was being ran by the Transport Workers Union, a union long controlled by various families, and that was at this point under the full control of the Messina family. This was made possible in 2005, when the Transport Workers Union would name Jack Duffy, a longtime Messina family associate from Steinway, as their president. Libel, at this time, would name Mel Toblowski, another Messina affiliate, as foreman of the Columbus Avenue project. But the Messinas deeply entrenched in this project from the beginning. They would plan to see millions from city money. With the Volpe brothers now gone, and their crew mostly split up, Harvey Noto in Sicily would order acting boss Chucky Lino to assign the Columbus Avenue job to the Centraccio crew. Vito Centraccio at this time would also inherit many of the rackets in the Opium Nights and Majestic hotels formerly ran by Mark Volpe, while the Gambetti family, which was being ran by John Gravelli and Roy Zito, would receive percentages on both the Columbus and Frankfort Avenue projects, and the Lupicellas would work out deals with the Messinas. The Ancelotti family would be completely left out of any interest in these jobs. This would create friction specifically with the Ancelottis and the Messinas, as the Columbus Avenue area happened to be Ancelotti territory dating back nearly 100 years. It was at this point that Giovanni the Old Man Ancelotti and his family would plan a takeover of the Columbus Avenue project. Then in March of 2008, an Alderney crew of the Ancelotti crime family, led by powerful capo Carlo the Rock Boccoli, would plan to take over the lucrative Columbus Avenue project through the interrogation of a union official, John Balsetti. They would carry out this plan, summoning Balsetti to meet one of their up-and-coming associates, Rocco Pelosi, at the Golden Pier Swingers Golf Club in Algonquin for what Balsetti believed to be a business proposition. However, as Balsetti would meet Pelosi at the club, Pelosi would beat Balsetti, tie him to a golf cart, and drive golf balls at him, eventually obtaining crucial information from Balsetti in the process. While this was happening, the Vito Centraccio crew, who was watching Balsetti, would send several enforcers from his crew to the golf club to take out Pelosi. Then, in Albany cavalcades and armed with automatic weapons, Centraccio crew members Nicky Soriello, Dean DeRazio, Vinny DeBello, Joey Ozzolo, Frank Testa, Bruno Testa, Sal DeBello, Carmen Romano, Franco Spano, and Nick Ticci would storm the golf club, opening fire. This would, however, be major loss for the Messina family, as an unknown shooter would take out 8 Centraccio soldiers. The only survivors sent by Vito Centraccio were Dean DeRazio, Franco Spano, and Nick Ticci, who chased the shooter out of the club before losing him. In the course of this, Rocco Pelosi would manage to escape with John Balsetti, and Pelosi would further interrogate Balsetti in Alderney before killing him. In Rocco Pelosi's interrogation of Balsetti, Pelosi would obtain crucial information on the Messina family's union interest, as Rocco Pelosi would bring this information straight to his uncle Vincent Pelosi, a soldier in the Ancelotti family's Boccoli crew. The Boccoli crew would begin to plan their takeover of the Columbus Avenue project. As this was happening, a wealthy real estate developer from Dubai, Yusuf Amir, had begun the construction of a massive project in Castle Garden City, Algonquin. As the various labor unions in Liberty City would try to control this development, it became clear that Yusuf Amir would be uncooperative and intended to run the project completely independent from any union. In April of 2008, Chucky Lino and Harry Hall would spring for control of the Castle Gardens project, sending more than 20 enforcers from the Centraccio crew and the old Volpe crew to storm and shut down the construction site. Amir would eventually be given an ultimatum to either give up the massive project into the hands of the Messina family unions or to pay millions to the Messinas in tax. Subsequently, when the enforcers would return the following day to the Castle Gardens site, Yusuf Amir would reach out to his connections in various syndicates around the city to seek protection. Then, the North Holland Hustlers street gang, ran by Trey Playboy X Stewart, would contract an unknown hitman to take out the Messina family enforcers on the Castle Gardens construction site. As the hitman got to Castle Gardens, the Messina family would be dealt a tremendous blow, as 21 of the enforcers would be killed, including 8 made men. This loss would be extremely detrimental for the Messinas, as many of the enforcers killed in Castle Gardens were important figures in the family, and this would eventually lead to the extinction of the old Volpe crew. Soon after this, in July of 2008, the Ancelotti family would order an unknown hitman to take out several key figures in the Columbus Avenue project. In the same day, Mel Toblowski, libel foreman, would be killed on Frankfurt Avenue in a crane explosion. Jack Duffy, TWU president, would be killed in North Holland in a train explosion, and Tony Vignelli, LTA chief executive, would be killed at Francis International Airport in an explosion of his private jet. The loss of these key figures in the Messina family's construction interests would cripple their ability to control the Columbus Avenue job, and soon the Columbus Avenue project would be once again up for grabs. Following this, the Ancelotti family would fall into problems of their own, finding themselves at war with several other crime syndicates around the city, and because of this, a second Ancelotti-Messina war would never take place. As the Messina crime family entered the 2010s, the aging Harvey Noto seemed to be increasingly less involved in running Messina family from Sicily, and acting boss Chucky Lino was beginning to be known as the true boss of the family. While the family was expecting more indictments as a result of Fredo Volpe's tape recordings, particularly for Harry Hall and Chucky Lino, it was beginning to become clear that the disappearance of Fredo Volpe had put a major strain in the federal case against the Messina family, and Harvey Noto, Chucky Lino, and Harry Hall would continue to run the Messina family into the 2010s. The Messina family is still active around Liberty City and involved in various forms of extortion, gambling, theft, laundering, fencing, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, prostitution, and murder, and the Messina family is still considered to be one of Liberty City's most feared families.